Well, it was really hard for me to pick five pieces and only five pieces, but in my opinion, it's really tough to top a Wrightson Frankenstein plate. The caption to this one was to examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death. So, from the original Marvel book, this plate was used, I think, near the end of chapter 4 when Victor's talking about obtaining cadavers from graveyards and morgues to mine, hunks and chunks of body parts to make his creation. It became available about, oh gosh, I think it was about 10 years ago, and a dealer, and not one of the usual suspects, he had this piece and he posted on Comic Art L that he'd be running a private live auction for it. It was kind of an odd way to do it, but I took the bait. It was rather surreal. I knew it was going to cost me more than any single piece of art that I owned at the time, but I came prepared to win. So the way the dealer did it was over the phone. He'd take a bid from me, then say, okay, hold on a minute, and he'd go away, and I guess he'd take another bid, and it went back and forth like that, him flipping back and forth from line to line, and I gotta say, it dawned on me about halfway through that there was a distinct possibility that he was just going to the fridge to get a beer and then coming back and telling me the increment had risen. But how could you not feel that way, doing something as non-transparent as this? But it didn't matter to me. It's a Frankenstein plate, and it was a grail of mine. The dealer had a good reputation, and honestly, today I'm certain there was someone on the other end. Anyway, I obviously I won it, and I entered it in one of the Comic Art L Best of the Year competitions. I think it might have either won or come in second. I don't know, I probably lost to a half-naked Adam Hughes commission if it came in second. But I did get an email from the apparent underbidder after I made it public, and he congratulated me and said that he really wanted it, but he was glad it went to a good home. And then I went to his calf gallery, and I didn't really see much suggesting that, he could have dropped that kind of money. But then again, he might be like me and doesn't choose to share a lot. Regardless, I'm glad I've got it. It's just so rare to find plates of the monster. And the line work in this thing is just exceptional. This was Bernie's homage to Franklin Booth. The detail and the depth are insane, and it's reminiscent of early 19th century woodcuts and steel engravings. And it's a fitting style for a Gothic romance, which is really what Frankenstein the novel is, kind of a creepy Gothic romance. Bernie has said in an interview with Steve Niles a few years ago that it took him 7 years to complete this project. And this was done before he broke his wrist. I guess the bones in his wrist healed differently, so he really can't hold a pen the correct way to do this sort of thing anymore. Anyway, I have Frankenstein monster art from many artists: Plug, San Julian, Mike Hoffman, Jack Davis. And to be honest, the only piece I'd really like to add to complete the collection is a Lind Ward Frankenstein wood engraving. But this remains the most remarkable of all the illustrated Frankenstein volumes, and it'll never leave this collection until, well, probably I'm on a slab of my own. Okay, so this is obviously Kane and Romita with letters by the great Artie Simek. I jumped onto the Amazing Spider-Man train at about issue 100 as a kid, which was probably around 71 or so, which would have made me about 11 years old. Spider-Man 100 completely jumped out at me on the spinner rack, with its Codolith-like background and the full-color Spider-Man in front. I immediately liked it. And at the end of it, we saw Peter Parker take some potion or something so he could live happily ever after with Gwen without those pesky spider powers getting in the way, only to find that the potion instead turned him into a six-legged spider. But of course they were arms. So by the next issue, I was completely hooked. And I mean, this cover just has everything for me. It's got the superhero bit, it's got the monster tie-in, and it's just such a memorable storyline. At the end of the issue, the Lizard and Morbius face off with Spider-Man, setting up the next square-bound 25 center. That was ASM 102. And this was my favorite period of the book, right up to issue number 103 when Spider-Man's in the Savage Land with Kazar. It was just a great time to read Spider-Man. I got this from Berkey. He put it up and I jumped on it immediately. It was back when Mike would take trade, cash, time payments. By today's standards, I got a deal, but like anything else, it was a lot for me at the time. I traded away some really nice stuff to get this thing. I traded a Sinnott Marvel's Greatest Comics cover with the entire FF. I traded a Ditko Kirby FF annual page, which had Spidey in it to boot, and that was probably the hardest one to part with. I think I traded a Kirby Stone FF31 page, maybe a Miller DD page, but it was later, so it was probably more Jansen than Miller. But I did about half trade and half cash, and Mike did fine in the long run. In fact, I'm willing to bet all of them together today would fetch more than just this cover, but none were iconic like this. I don't regret it at all. Mike was pretty generous. He took time payments and then sent me the art when I sent him my trade, even before I had cut the check. So Mike has always treated me right. I get the most requests for this than anything I own. But to be fair, there are a lot of things that I don't put up, so no one has seen. But I've turned down a few really attractive offers for it, maybe someday. I think this is just one of the best Bronze Age covers, hands down, and it's iconic, an iconic image from just a very memorable storyline. So I have about 5 Plug covers. I've got a really nice Man-Thing, a couple Monster of Frankenstein covers, a Ghost Rider, and this. It was hard to choose which one to show because I love them all, but I picked this one because it's twice the monsters for your buck. So this is the continuation from Tomb of Dracula 18, which is a great Colin Palmer cover, but this one takes the prize because it's all Plug. And Werewolf by Night I think it was a few issues behind Tomb of Dracula, getting its start after the success of that title. But this was the showdown between Dracula and the Wolfman on Russoff Manor, and it's Plug inking himself, whereas I think Frank Chiaramonte inked the interiors. Plug to me is dope, and I dig him for the same reasons that I love Jack Davis. Both of those guys had this pseudo animation style to their work. It's a bit cartoony, yet it's pretty realistic at the same time, and both did really cool monsters. I picked this up from someone who I'd identify probably as a collector dealer. I guess that's probably as far as I'll go. It's someone who I'd bought from before, who I think sort of goes back and forth a bit, from dealer to collector. And we're good, but, he made me bleed for it. As with a lot of these Marvel covers, there are some very noticeable changes. So either that was done in production, or possibly Mike made some changes to the artwork after it was returned to him. The sky is black in the art. It's been changed to kind of a dusky blue on the cover with a few clouds added for effect. And the windows on the printed cover, they're not darkened. So I would imagine that got changed in production. But the best thing about Plug covers, I think, is his blue line pencil that you can see very clearly underneath. I have this image in my head of Plug kind of lightly blocking out his figures in blue pencil, harkening back to his animation days when he actually worked for Hanna-Barbera and Filmation, and then really finishing it off in ink. Actually, I don't think Plug did super tight pencils. I believe most of the embellishing was done in ink, and man, you have to be pretty confident as a draftsman to do that. I love this cover. It's a great cover. This is the only EC cover I own, but what a cover. It's one of my top 3 favorite Jack Davis covers. But the other 2, they're locked away in permanent collections forever, probably. This cover came from the Don Lineberger collection. Don lived in Valdosta, Georgia, and was a pretty successful banjo player in his youth. He played for the Smothers Brothers and Glenn Campbell, I think. He was also a pretty big strip art collector, I'm told, and had a number of EC pieces. Sadly, Don died from smoke inhalation when his home burned back in 2010. Some of the art was destroyed, but some was in, I think, some sort of metal filing cabinet maybe, but it survived, and this was one of them. And not to be gruesome, but you can see the edges of the piece have been singed a bit. I never knew the guy, but others I know who collect spoke pretty fondly of him. He was a big fan. I think about him every time I look at this cover. But on to happier things. A phenomenal brushwork cover done by Jack Davis. Again, like Plug, you can see the cartoonist's unmistakable eye, the faces in particular, yet it has a good bit of realism to it as well. I love the composition of the piece with the 4 figures surrounding the vampire and the mallet precariously looming above the stake, drawing your eye down towards the vampire. And this guy over here holding the stake, is he more worried that Mallet is going to miss and break his wrist, or that the vampire is going to wake just before the money shot and rip out his throat? Just a great Jack Davis cover. There's also a classic vampire story inside the comic written by Al Feldstein called By Dawn's Early Light, which is about a guy who travels from Chicago to New York and forgets to set his watch, so I guess he's off by about an hour or so, allowing the vampire that he's tied up to escape after he pleads with him, only to have his throat ripped out. It's just one of those great Feldstein O. Henry endings. And this cover has nothing to do with that, but I imagine Al told Jack there was a vampire story in the book, hence the cover. There's only one Jack Davis cover that I like more than this, and that would be those little kids running from the werewolf. Maybe someday I'll figure out how to pry that one loose. Okay, Jeff Jones Haunted cover. Not comic art by any means, but I had to add a Jones painting here. I've got quite a few Jones paintings, most from his illustration days, but a few of the later fine art paintings as well. This was the cover to Psycho number 12. That was the Skywald magazine that was basically a creepy and an eerie-like publication from the 70s. It was Saul Brodsky's baby, and it had sister titles, just like Warren had. So there was Psycho, there was Nightmare, there was Scream, and Jones did a few more notable covers for Brodsky. There's a really nice Nightmare cover called The Love Witch, with a woman riding a winged-like iguana, but this is the better painting, I think. This was in Bill Howard's collection for years, and I finally convinced him to sell it to me. I think that I've always gravitated to it because, in my opinion, it's Jeff's most Frazetta-like painting, in a way. It was done during that period when he was still pretty tight in terms of being a figurative painter, because soon after this, he got into that much looser and really more geometric phase with his figures. And I just, you know what? I love the space helmets that Jones did. He, and by the way, I'm using that pronoun because this was before he became a she, but he revisited this spaceman many times in his black and white work. The short comic stories Home and Union specifically, and at least one or two more paintings. I've just always liked that oblong oval space helmet. I can't really explain it, but it was sort of his signature spaceman in a way. But the girl, the giant, just a really iconic Jones cover. Albert Moy found out that I had this, and he asked me if it still smelled like champagne. And I guess he owned it for many years, and during a New Year's party one day, or New Year's Eve party rather, someone spilled champagne all over it. I'm happy to report that it doesn't smell.